we get to talk about something that is really, really exciting to me. I have never had the opportunity to teach on the Red Heifer sacrifice until today. And I've learned a lot about the sacrifice. I mean, over the years, many of you have probably heard Rico's teaching on the Red Heifer. There's multiple teachings that you can find on the Red Heifer sacrifice. Today, I'm going to show you something about this particular sacrifice that is hopefully going to challenge the way that you look at it and hopefully blow your mind as much as it has me the last week and a half or so. If anybody's been watching my posts on Facebook, I've been throwing out little hints about what we're going to talk about. But before we get to that, I want to share with you guys a little bit of how my family came into Torah and how we started on this whole walk. I don't think I've ever explained this to you guys before. If I have, sorry, but you're going to hear it again. And the reason why I want to share this with you is because it leads to the reason on why I study this stuff and present it the way that I do. You've heard the story how I got hooked up with Cortez. Everybody knows that story. In 2007, my family moved here from Youngstown, Ohio. You guys know that, right? We were here for 6 months, and we moved back to Ohio. So we moved here, I think it was May of that year. In October, we felt like we made a huge mistake. We missed home. We said, okay, we're packing up our stuff. We're heading back to Ohio. The second we get on the highway on 70, heading out into Missouri, I just start getting this feeling in my stomach. I mean, like I'm getting ready to blow my cookies at any time. This is wrong. And I didn't say anything. Just, you know, we're all in the car. These guys were little. I mean, this was 10 years ago. And so we keep driving, and the feeling in my stomach is just getting worse and worse and worse. Like, this is the wrong thing. We're making a huge mistake. Huge. And come to find out is that my wife was having, you know, basically the same feelings as she's sitting next to me navigating, and we're driving back home. It's a 16-hour drive to Youngstown, Ohio. So we already had an apartment lined up. We were moving back into a 2-bedroom apartment. I had already got my old job back at the bridge fabrication facility that I used to manage, but I was going back as a fitter and a welder back on the floor. You know, I already got my job back. We had already packed up all of our stuff in an ABF truck and shipped it back. I mean, we didn't move it. We shipped the stuff back ourselves. So the truck was already supposed to get there the next day that we were going to get there. So that night we were supposed to stay with my mother-in-law until we got the keys to our apartment, and we were going to go unload the truck and do all this stuff and get settled back in. This was on a Thursday. We were going to unpack everything on Friday. I was supposed to be back to work on Monday, working 10-hour days. We get into Youngstown, pull up to my mother-in-law's apartment, and I looked over at my wife and I was like, this is a huge mistake. We are not supposed to be here. Finally, I said it. And she agreed. I'm like, so what are we going to do? We got to go back. So we were living with some people at the time, and we called them up and said, can we come back? And yes, it gets funnier, trust me. And I was out of the steel business the first time we moved here. I was working for Olathe Ford RV, working on RVs. It was a fantastic job. I mean, I was basically doing my dream job of working on houses is what I really want to do. But I was actually working, doing that for RVs. I mean, huge $1 million RVs, trailers. I mean, you guys all know how many variations there were. So I had a good job. And so I'm going back to the steel business when I moved back to Ohio, right? So anyway, we called up the people we were living with, I mean, before we even got in the house. And they're like, no, man, you guys can't come back here. You guys got to figure out what you want to do. I'm like, okay, so that's out. I called up the RV center, and I called my old boss, and I said, hey, can I come back? He's like, yeah, when are you going to make it back? I was like, well, I got to work. I'm going to have to work 2 jobs. I said, well, I'll be back in 6 months. He's like, I'll have a job waiting for you when you get back. It's like, sweet. So I'll get my old job back at the RV center. So we spent the next 6 months, right, working 2 jobs, 2 steel jobs, trying to save up money so we can get back to Kansas. Life is in turmoil at this point. I'm going crazy. But let me back up a little bit. When I left the RV center, is they hired somebody to replace me, right? They brought this guy in there that was going to be the RV tech that replaced me because I was getting ready to quit. And he started like the week before I quit, so I got to hang out with him a little bit. I thought he was like this Christian guy, and we were talking about all these Christian teachers and stuff like that at the time, and we were talking Bible stuff. And he had a van almost identical to the one that we had at that time, and he was trying to sell it. And I was like, dude, I can't take 2 cars back. I said, maybe if I get back, because I needed a second car when I got back, I said, maybe I'll just contact you, and maybe we can figure out a way where I can come pick it up after I'm all moved and settled back home. He said, okay, here's my number. So I put his number in my wallet. So I get back to Ohio. I'm working, right? When we first got back, we were going through all this stuff of figuring out why did God allow us to make these mistakes, right? I know I made the mistakes, but why are we going through this stuff? So I started doing this whole popular Daniel fast thing that goes on amongst Christian people. Anybody ever heard of it? You fast with fruits and vegetables and watermelon seeds, bark, all kinds of stuff for 21 days. And then you fast and you pray and you do all this other kind of stuff. So I started doing this thinking, okay, I'm going to get the answers I'm looking for. I'm going to figure out what am I supposed to be doing? Why did I make these wrong decisions? Why are we going through literal hell? I'm working 2 jobs trying to get back to a place I just left, blah, blah, blah. So I would go in this apartment that we lived in. The biggest room that we had in this place was the bathroom. I'm telling you, the bathroom was probably from that door. You'd walk in the door. It was long and skinny. You'd walk in that door and the bathroom would probably go to that chair. That's how big it was. It was like bigger than our bedrooms. Remember that bathroom? I don't know if you remember it. Anyway, so I would go in this bathroom and I would get on my knees, and that was my prayer time. And I would go in there and pray while I'm doing this fast and stuff like that, right? Well, this Bible that I got was given to me by somebody that was here in Kansas that would come to our house, and we would do some Bible studies with some guys and stuff like that. And he bought me this Bible. So I took it home with me, and I used this Bible. I took it in the bathroom, and I'm praying every single day for 21 days, 1 psalm. Can anybody take a guess what that psalm was? Just take a guess. 119. 119. I'm in there praying. I don't have Torah yet. I don't know anything about this Jewish stuff. I'm in my bathroom on my knees for 21 days praying Psalm 119 every single day, highlighting it. Teach me your ways, teach me your ways, teach me your ways. Let me know about your Torah. What's a Torah? I want to be righteous and do all this kind of stuff, right? You wouldn't think that's a big deal. Hopefully you guys see what it is a big deal. So, get through all this.
Praying in the bathroom is a big deal.
Praying in the bathroom is an awesome thing. Don't let anybody deter you from that. It's very private. You guys get me off on these rabbit trails. So, now we're going back to the process of we're trying to save up money, trying to get everything, trying to find a place to live. So I look at my wallet, lo and behold, I'm going back to the RV place, right? I'm coming back to Kansas, I'm going to Olathe Ford RV. The guy who took my place is still working there. I called him up. I was like, hey man, I'm coming back. I'm going to be there in 6 months. I need to see if you guys can help us find a place. I can't travel out there, and look for a place. Can you guys help us locate some rental properties? I'll contact them. We'll see if we can find some pictures and stuff like that. Sure. Ends up finding us a place directly across the street from them in Gardner. I'm thinking, wow, this is awesome. And the place in the neighborhood was like 3 miles from the Olathe Ford RV Center. So I could ride a bike to work, I could run to work, I could do whatever. So I'm going to be working side by side with this guy and living across the street from him. So we would ride our bikes back and forth to the RV center to work, right? Fast forward to May 2008, we're back, get this place. The place is identical to the place that they're living in. Right across the street, driveway is driveway. I'm working side by side with this guy. May 2008, we're back. I'm working at the RV center. We're working side by side. We start getting into our scriptural discussions again. This guy starts ripping into me about eating hot dogs. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? This doesn't make any sense. I thought you were like this good Christian guy. We used to talk about all this good Christian stuff. Come to find out, he was this messianic guy. right? Huh?
One of those.
One of those. Now, mind you, I've told you, I was a good Christian. My wife and I were good Christians. We did youth ministry, we prayed, we read the Bible, we helped with the Christmas plays. Prayed in the bathroom. So I'm thinking something is not right with this dude. But I'm the type of person, if you're going to show me something, I'm going to investigate it so I could, number one, I'm going to prove you wrong. Or number two, so I could believe it and I could fix and adjust what I'm doing.
But you approached it with the idea of proving him wrong.
I did, for sure, which I still do that to a lot of people today.
Right.
Only on certain topics. So I started investigating all this stuff, right? Talking to me about eating pork and eating clean and holidays and all that kind of stuff. Starts talking to me about Michael Rood and all kinds of other people. And trust me, when you start investigating this type of stuff and you come across these teachers and stuff like that, it gets kind of scary. But anyway, it took me about 1 month to realize that everything that I was doing and everything this guy was saying was 100% correct. Because I found it in Scripture, right? That's where this hunger for context really just exploded. I mean, I always wanted to know context, and we always challenged our pastor back home in the Methodist/Pentecostal church with context. If you have never heard it, look it up. It is a thing. It's real. But we always used to challenge him because we wanted actual context to Scripture, right? Well, and that's where it kind of started. But then once I started going into Torah and realizing all this stuff in 2008, my life has been completely changed. I mean, everybody's here that's been walking this has, right? It may not have been for the last 10 years. It may only be a year, 2, 5, or whatever. But the thing is that if you truly, truly, truly want to understand context, then we've got to study. We've got to be in our bathrooms praying. Maybe not your bathroom, but you need to be praying and seeking and asking Him to show you. Because trust me, I just prove it to you that He will show you. It may be in the midst of every trial or something that's going on in your life, but He will show you if you ask Him. Okay? With that being said, when we start getting into this, I'm realizing more and more every single day that we don't have a clue about the sacrificial system. A clue. And I've said this time and time and time again, is that if we're going to understand the work of Yeshua, and that's what we all want to understand, we're never all going to be there 100%, never. But we got to be consistently progressing. But if you want to understand the work of Yeshua, you cannot do away with temple service, ever. And I'm seeing elements of the red heifer sacrifice that points us directly back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, which is complete restoration. So today we have a unique opportunity where we're actually going to read the verses in chapter 19 together, so they're fresh in your brain if you haven't read the Torah portion yet for this week, and present this in a little bit of a different perspective. Okay? But I want to give you some of this little information here about what the Jewish people believe about the red heifer. And there's lots of things that you can learn about the red heifer. I mean, they're actually trying to raise red cows in Jerusalem right now. They actually have people all around the world that they're looking at their red heifers that people are claiming could be the possible one, right? And the Jewish people believe that there's actually will be 10 red heifers, the last one being Messiah, right? But they actually believe there was 9 used, and we point directly to Yeshua being the 10th. And this always points to Yeshua. Don't ever take that for granted. Don't ever doubt that any of these sacrifices don't point to Him, because they do. They always point to Him. But here's what the Jewish people talk about in the Midrash about King Solomon. 4 laws cannot be explained by human reason, but being divine, demand implicit obedience. To marry one's brother's widow, not to mingle wool and linen in a garment, to perform the rite of the scapegoat, and to perform the rite of the red cow. Even the wise and venerable King Solomon purportedly said, "All these I have comprehended," speaking of ordinances, "but as regards the section dealing with the red heifer, I have investigated and inquired and examined. I said, I will get wisdom, but it was far from me." So the Midrash, and we don't necessarily know that or believe that King Solomon would have said that, right? But they believe that King Solomon did not understand the full context or complexity of the red heifer. And I'm not saying that we are going to learn all of that today either, but what I want to present to you today is a different perspective, in that maybe if we looked at things pointing it back to Scripture being a temple text, which we're going to talk about in a second, then we would have a better grasp on why some of these sacrifices are so troubling to us in understanding them. Okay? So Jewish tradition teaches that only Moses knew the full meaning of this law, which must be obeyed even though not understood. And we do that almost every day with some of the commandments, right? When we're coming into learning Torah, I mean, we're keeping commands and not knowing really how to do them. But it's a progression. It's about learning. It's about growing. You know, you don't have to get everything perfect. Eventually we want to do that. We want to be perfect. But it's about learning them. Even though when he tells you, he commands you to do something, we do it anyway, even if we don't understand. Like flying cows, how you like that? My wife is really loving my PowerPoints now. So this is where we're actually going to read the text of Numbers 19 together, so you guys can have it fresh in your brain, and then we're going to pick it apart. It's only 11:30, and I've got 4 hours, you guys told me, so unless my wife comes in here and tells me I got to end because food's done. Numbers 19:2. This is the law of the Torah, which Yahweh has commanded, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, that they bring you a red heifer, a perfect one, in which there is no blemish, and on which a yoke has never come. And you shall give it to Eleazar the priest, and he shall bring it outside the camp, and shall slaughter it before him. And Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger, and sprinkle some of its blood 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. And the heifer shall be burned before his eyes. He burns its hide, its flesh, and its blood, and its dung. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet, and throw them into the midst of the fire burning the heifer. The priest shall then wash his garments, and shall bathe his body in water. Afterward come into the camp, but the priest is unclean until evening. And he who is burning it washes his garments in water, and shall bathe his body in water, and is unclean until evening. And a clean man shall gather up the ashes of the heifer, and shall place them outside the camp in a clean place, and they shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for the water for uncleanliness. It is for the cleansing from sin. And for the unclean being, they shall take some of the ashes of the heifer burnt for cleansing from sin, and running water shall put on them in a vessel. And a clean man shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, and shall sprinkle it on the tent, and on the vessels, and on the beings who were there, or on the one who touches a bone, or the slain, or the dead, or a grave. And the clean one shall sprinkle the unclean on the 3rd day and the 7th day. Now notice the highlighted portions here. Keep those in the forefront of your mind, because that's what we're going to be talking about. And on the 7th day he shall cleanse himself, and shall wash his garments, and bathe in water, and shall be clean in the evening. Verse 20. But the man who is unclean and does not cleanse himself, that being shall be cut off from among the assembly, because he has defiled the set-apart place of Yahweh. Water for uncleanliness has not been sprinkled on him. He is unclean, and it shall be a law for them forever. And the one who sprinkles the water for uncleanness washes his garments. And the one who touches the water for uncleanness is unclean until evening. And whatever the unclean being touches is unclean. And the being who touches it is unclean until evening. You seen a pattern here? So, basically, who is unclean? There's a whole lot of people in there that was unclean, right? So basically what happens is we have this issue of somebody that's dying in the midst of people in Israel. And it has to be dealt with. So Yahweh implements this offering, this sacrifice, in order to be able to deal with the impurity of death. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But if you look at all these people, Numbers 19:8, and he who is burning it washes his garments in water, and shall bathe in the body in water, and is unclean. So the guy who's burning the heifer is unclean. Not necessarily. And he who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his garments, and is unclean. Totally different person. He who touches the dead of any human being is unclean for 7 days. Anyone in the open field who touches someone slain by a sword or has died, a bone of a man or a grave is unclean for 7 days. The bottom line is this affects every single person in the community. Because at some point, right? At some point, everyone is going to come in contact with something that touched a dead body. So it has to be dealt with. Okay? I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about some rabbinical observances amongst believers, Messianics, Jewish people, or whatever. I tend to have a real issue with people that force additional rabbinic observations onto people as far as cleanliness is concerned, when the reality is every single one of us in this room, I'm pretty confident I could say this, has been in contact with a dead family member or anything like that. You've been to funerals, right? We're all unclean. So don't try to force, I'm not saying anybody here, well, if you are, listen up. Don't try to force your religious observance of being pure, not even wanting to use a bathroom because you don't know if a woman's been in there that's been unclean, or sitting on a chair because you don't know if a woman's been unclean. The reality is every single one of us have been unclean, and still, I'm sorry, we have not been cleansed by the ashes of the red heifer, right? It's okay to learn these things, but don't force your religious observance of how strict you want to walk. If that's what you want to do, fine. But just realize that that whole issue still makes you unclean. Still makes us impure, and it has not been dealt with yet. So y'all in here are just as dirty as me. So I show you this because ultimately this affected the entire community. Okay? And it affects us. So while it has affected us and we're still waiting, this is why they're actually waiting for that next red heifer, right? So I am of the belief that they cannot institute any of the sacrificial system until they take care of the red heifer sacrifice for the priest that will be ministering at the altar. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? It's pretty important when it happens. And I know within Messianics or Christian communities, they try to teach away from the red heifer sacrifice and other sacrifices for that matter, because they think everything points to Yeshua, so you don't have to worry about that. And that if you do anything with that red heifer, then, oh, no. If you guys learn anything from us, don't ever speak out against anything in the temple arena when it occurs. They may not believe like you, but there's a purpose and a functionality to why they're doing it, right?
You can't really have an observance without sacrifice.
Not yet. So, the impurity resulting from corpse contamination is the most severe within the whole spectrum of impurity, death being the chief exception of all forms of impurity. The fuller understanding of the textual presentation of the red heifer cannot, therefore, be divorced from the biblical cosmology which undergirds it. Primeval history, Israel's story of origins, which itself is a story of cosmic pollution and purgation by means of water, destruction, and recreation. Indeed, as a redaction, Genesis 1-9 has retold the primeval history in the light of Israel's ideas about pollution. Cosmology is thus the ideological framework for ritual action. Now, I've told you guys this for the last year and a half. The Bible is a what? Temple text. Rodney, you get an extra piece of bread later. It is a temple text. Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is not about the material origins of the universe like we've been told time and time again. And if you're a homeschool kid, hopefully you're learning this. You know, if you're a Common Core kid, you need some help. But the Bible is meant to be a temple text, which means from Genesis 1, it's establishing Yahweh's temple in the heavenly realm. And in Revelation 22, we see the heavens and the earth renewed, recompleted after this whole entire 7,000-year plan of restoration since the time that Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. Fall of mankind, right? So it's a temple text. So if that's the case, then we're going to see lots of elements within the sacrificial system that's going to point us, obviously, to the functionality of this restoration. And that's what I'm finding with the red heifer sacrifice. And while I was doing this, yesterday I was finishing the PowerPoint, and I'm going to tell you the resource that I've been using in a second. I'm actually going to have to turn this into a 3-hour series because I couldn't even cover all the elements of it pointing back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. We're going to focus on a few things, but I've got to do a whole series on this thing now because we don't, I mean, I know you guys say I could teach for 4 hours, but I don't have 4 hours of the material ready. You know what I mean? Because there's so much, and these Christian scholars have found this stuff out, and it's like you read it, and you're like, man, how do you not get this? You know? But the resource that I'm using for this, and I can send it to you, it's in a PDF. It's a 350-page thesis by a guy named Joel Richard Heumann, and it's called The Ceremony of the Red Heifer, Its Purpose and Function in the Narrative Context. Now, all the information that I'm sharing with you today it comes from chapter 5. Only from chapter 5, and I couldn't even take all of the elements pointing it back into cosmology and Israel's birth and existence and restoration into today's teaching. It's amazing. So, the cosmological narratives are the keys which unlock symbolism of the red heifer. And Numbers 19 fittingly gives a procedure by which the pollution brought by contact with the corpse may be countered. Since following the plague, death was all around. Almost everyone would have been in contact with the corpse, and virtually all could have been excluded. So basically what it's saying is that the timing in the book of Numbers of where this sacrifice happens, right? Now remember what's happened up until this point. You've had all of these rebellions, right? All of these rebellions, all of this death. We just had Korah's rebellion last week, right? Yahweh sent the plague, burnt the outskirts of the camp, sucked up Korah and all his people into that big hole. Death is huge. Aaron and Miriam, I think, is in this Torah portion or the last Torah portion where they died, right? This week. Yeah, it's after this chapter. So you have all of this death of an impurity that has to be dealt with now. Because if you look at it in Leviticus or search for the red heifer, you don't have all of the details pertaining to this until now. So it's strategically placed within the book of Numbers at this specific point to be a focal point, right? But it's also going to show a bigger picture of the complete restoration of everything through the sacrifice. It's pretty amazing. It is proposed that, another flying cow, that's a big one. It is proposed that through the use of certain elusive keywords and phrases, the text of Numbers 19 is intentionally related to the biblical cosmology of Genesis 1 through 3. Does everybody know what cosmology is? No? Okay, cosmology is basically the ancient world had a belief. Every single nation had a blueprint or a story of existence of how their own world, universe came into being, right? Which gods were the creators? Which gods created this part? Which gods created this part? Which god lived in this temple, that temple? This is why I say that when Yah told Moshe to write the book of Genesis, it wasn't saying, hey, this is for those people in the 21st century. Let's explain to them that, I'm the creator who created everything out of this material. No. Moshe was writing this because he was trying to determine to all the people that were going to come into covenant, and once Israel was established, that no, your gods and your cosmology or your blueprint did not create the universe. They don't live in this temple. They don't function in this way, this way, this way, this way. My God is the one who created everything. His temple was established at the very beginning in 7 days. After the seventh day, he sat on his throne to manage complete order. So cosmology is the blueprint, so to speak, of what each nation believed on how everything came into existence, but not by means of material origins, but by means of functionality and which God ran the universe. Does it make sense? So every nation had this. And I'm not making it up. I mean, you could figure this out very easily. But every single nation understood that. And I'm not saying that we can't use Genesis 1, 2, and 3 to counteract that, right? But my point of view is that the functionality and the purpose of those verses is to establish Yahweh's honor and not some other God's honor. So, the wilderness itself. becomes a principal spatial metaphor for the theme of death which runs throughout the narrative of Numbers. It is associated with the periphery, the undomesticated, the uncivilized, the res lo zeruah, land unsown. It is the dwelling place of wild and demonic creatures, and the refuge of outlaws and fugitives. The Pentateuchal narrative views the wilderness in light of these negative connotations. It is that great and terrible wilderness in Deuteronomy 1:19 to which the fugitive Hebrews flee. There they encounter hunger, thirst, snakes, and scorpions, and fierce desert nomads. The difficulty of life in the wilderness is repeatedly contrasted with the security of life in the Promised Land. The wilderness is desolate, the land is fertile. The wilderness is chaos, and the land is rest. Now, the reason why I'm talking to you about this, because this is all, the book of Numbers is all about the wilderness experience, right? Right? Okay. You guys can't go to sleep yet. This is all about the wilderness experience. The wilderness experience is meant to be a liminal period, okay? A liminal period is basically a threshold. It's a Latin term for the word threshold, okay? So Yahweh calls the children of Israel out of Egypt. They can't just say, okay, this is why there's no rapture. You can't just go in a snap of a finger and go from one point to another point immediately. You've got to go through a transition period to where Yahweh takes you from point A to point B, right? So Israel's not technically ready to go into the Promised Land as soon as they leave Egypt, right? Hello, we read this all throughout the Torah. This is why he's wiping out the first generation, is because they're nothing but a bunch of complainers, a bunch of murderers, and rebellious people. So they've got to go through this threshold liminal period, right? So the wilderness equates to this large liminal period they've got to go through. They're going to go through it for 40 years. So separation, the exodus from Egypt, in which the crossing of the Red Sea marks the final break. That's the other thing too. Pay attention to the Red Sea. We're going to talk about that in a minute because we're moving into the water aspect of the sacrifice. But all of this is meant to see is they've got to go from point A to point B, but you've got to go through this transition period. Reincorporation, the crossing of the Jordan River. This is amazing. So they leave Egypt, right? So they cross the Red Sea, and we know that they're basically going through a trial by water ordeal like all the ancient Near Eastern nations believe. So they cross on dry ground, and then Yahweh brings back forth the waters. He swallows up the Egyptians, right? So as soon as they cross over that sea, across the Red Sea, they end up at Mount Sinai, right? Pretty close to it. So they end up going through, and they're going to be incorporated as a complete nation, as Israel, right? Well, that's not going to be complete until they fulfill the promise in which Yahweh gave them to go into the land. Okay? So they've got to go into the land. So then when they get to the land in Joshua, what happens to the Jordan? Same thing happens. They cross over on dry ground, right? And they take over the land of the promise. And this is where life is starting to happen. I want you to see that the wilderness also equates to death. Okay? So check this out. So the first generation, they're ultimately rejecting the life, which the life is attached to the land because it's attached to the promise, the blessing, the prosperity, everything Yahweh gives, right? So if that is all equates to life, in the first generation they go and they see the land, they send out the spies, and 10 come back. We just read it. They come back and they give this horrible report, right? So they're rejecting the life in which Yahweh says is life, because it's attached to the promise and the land and everything that he offers. And they're wanting to go back to Egypt, which put them back in slavery, back through the wilderness, back to death. So they're going to reject all of that. You ever looked at that before? They're actually rejecting life. The first generation. So if you're going to reject the life, then you have to die in the wilderness. This is why he's going to kill off the first generation. He's killing them off because they reject the promise of life that he offered to them. It's huge. So now when we see this,
Were they saved at all?
Huh?
Were they saved or were they damned?
I can't answer that question. I know they didn't get to see the promised land.
Jude verse 5 says they were saved.
Jude verse 5. Because obviously there must have been some sort of repentance there, right? But they still, because they rejected the promise of that land and the promise of which Yahweh said, then that's why Moses didn't enter the land, right? You know that? Moshe could not enter the land of Israel because he committed a willful act that we're going to read about, I think, next week.
No, this week.
This week. Struck the rock.
It's the same way as cause and effect. It's just like Adam and Eve weren't cursed necessarily, but there was a cause and effect of their sin. And they had to be
Exactly.
So
Exactly. So that every time that something happens, there's got to be that effect. And even though Moshe repented, I know that he repented. Well, I don't.
I was going to say,
I haven't met him, but
all the mistakes that we make,
yeah,
constantly,
right.
with all that we've been taught, and we continue to
Well, and there's always consequences for those things, right?
screw up.
We screw up bad enough, there's consequences, right?
Yeah.
Every single one of us has consequences. But the reality is that if we continue to stand back up and get up and ask for forgiveness, we repent, we're not going to be perfect yet. And I'm not saying that everybody that was in the wilderness was damned. I'm just trying to give you specific elements of thematic things surrounding the wilderness, surrounding the land, and being equated to life and death. Because because ultimately, if we just say, okay, we're going to reject this walk, and we end up rejecting Yeshua, this is where things get dangerous. So just looking at it from a little bit of a different perspective on what it actually is. But see, here now you have the generation. It's talking about the generation dying off, the first one, right? So now, all of a sudden, this is where we see the sacrifice of the red heifer come into the text. So there's got to be a theme around it. There's got to be a purpose and a function for that. So water in the wilderness. Water is certainly a common motif in the materials of this section of the book, beginning already with Numbers 19 and the red heifer. So we know how the water is used within the sacrifice. We read the text earlier, right? Immediately preceding Numbers 19, we see water as a theme in the following chapters. Water is the centerpiece of the narrative of Numbers 20, verses 2 through 13, Moshe striking the rock at the waters of Meribah. The term Ma'im itself is employed 7 times in this narrative. That ultimately means something as well. You see numbers that show up 7 times or words that show up 7 times. Pay attention. Yahweh works in patterns. Also, the drinking of water from the wells of Edom in Numbers 20, 14 through 21. And Sihon is germane to Israel's disputes with these nations. Also, we see it in the third oracle of Balaam in Numbers chapter 24, where he's talking about water, where he says, "How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the water. Their boughs drip with moisture, their roots have abundant water." So the theme of water throughout the book of Numbers and in the wilderness is something to pay attention to. It's something, oh, hey, maybe I should investigate this a little bit. The water in the wilderness motif thus thematizes the narrative turn which the book of Numbers takes at this juncture. Death is no longer a central theme, but rather life and the hope of the new generation as it journeys to the land of promise. So here's the question. I explained to you about liminal phases. Well, there's also liminal substances, right? So there's certain things that have to happen and certain elements that are used to get a person from point A to point B, right? Let me give you one quick example before I ask you the question. So when a leper comes back into the camp, who knows the process that happens to him when he comes back into the camp? The blood of the sacrifice gets pointed on his ear, lobe, his finger, and his toe. Do you know where that's done?
Priest.
No, not who. Where?
Oh,
Well,
where?
it's that,
Does anybody know where it's done?
At the door of the temple. Outside.
Out one of the doors of the temple, there's a door that's distinctly put there for the lepers, right? And the priest, and do you know how he does it? He doesn't just get to walk in there. He's got to stand outside. He's got to stick his head under there. And then he's got to go like this. And once that happens, then he's reintegrated. His status is elevated and he's back into the community, right? So, that's a liminal phase. So that threshold, he's actually crossing the threshold, right? That liminal period, but there's a substance that's involved that helps him to get to point A to point B. So he's gone from being outside the camp to inside the camp, and the substance that is used is the blood. So I ask you this question with this sacrifice. Is it the blood of the bull or the water mixture that acts as the driving liminal force for restoration? I didn't know. It's pretty amazing. So you don't have to give me an answer yet. It is often asserted by commentators that blood is the key substance in the ceremony of the red heifer. Blood being a liminal substance of sorts, which is capable of signifying both life and death as a tensive symbol, since it partakes of both of these states. If blood is a tensive symbol, then why is blood not actually used? Why instead are ashes combined with living fresh water in order to produce the water of cleanliness? By investigating other texts, it is water much more than blood that proves itself to be the tensive symbol with strong associations not just to life, but also to death. So remember that with blood, it talks about life in the blood and all this kind of stuff. Go ahead. Define liminal?
Please.
Liminal is a threshold. It is a period in between A and B that helps you get to A to B. Make sense?
Let's quit using it.
Huh? Quit using it? How about I use threshold? Threshold, does that work?
Second grade English.
Oh, you guys are funny. All right, so we'll use the word threshold from now on. A number of texts link the abode of the dead to Sheol with images of water, though only in poetic texts, particularly in Psalms where death and the descent to the underworld are understood to be metaphors for the troubles inflicting the individual. The depictions of the individual swallowed up by the primeval chaos waters in Genesis 1 denote the passing of that individual from the realm of creation, life, the earth, to that of the non-creation. So what I'm showing you here is that the mindset of the ancient world looked at the water as of one of two ways. It could either bring you death or it could bring you life. This is why you read in the Psalms, and I'm going to show you some of the verses in a second, and some of the other verses, you see this water ordeal all throughout Scripture, all throughout the ancient world, because they believed that the waterways were the gateways to the underworld. So if you're drowning in one, then that's going to bring you death. But we're going to see throughout Scriptures that water is also used to bring life.
You were getting ready to say something after that previous screen. We're talking about the difference between blood and water.
Oh, yes. Glad, thank you. So the reason why we're not focusing on the blood for this particular one is because I'm going to show you elements of why it is actually the water mixture, because it actually is an element of bringing life. But also the blood is used, how do I say this? It's only used on people with the leper, the elevation of the high priest, and when Moshe sprinkled the blood on the people at the time that they accepted the covenant. Blood is never used on people anywhere else in Scripture. So it doesn't really clean you. It's used as a detergent to clean the impurities off of the temple. This is where we get into a little bit of hairy stuff, especially with, our brothers and sisters that don't understand the functionality of blood in the temple arena. Blood is not used to cleanse people. Blood is used only to elevate the person back into the status like the leper or the high priest, or to cleanse the temple. The blood has the power to remove the stain of impurity from the temple altars and so on and so forth. It's not meant to clean people. Water is the cleaning part that cleanses people, cleanses individuals. Does that make sense?
Okay, so blood cleans the stain off the temple and also elevates.
And also elevates a person's status back. So the depths of the primordial waters become an appropriate image for death. Or to be alive is to be part of the created world. To be dead is to be uncreated. Now remember, creation, the word create in the ancient world, it doesn't mean like we've been taught. Create means something has a function. So if you're dead, that means you don't have a function. If you're alive, then you have function. Your life is what the Creator intended it to be in His image, which means you're supposed to bear the honor of your Creator, right? So, This is how they viewed the waters back then. So also the narrative theme of the water in the wilderness is often developed in other biblical materials as an allusion to the creation of the world from the primordial waters and the irrigation of fertile Eden. In these narratives, water plays the central role of the liminal/threshold substance, the medium, which brings about the change of state in each case. The water is the threshold of where death to life or creation occurs, or life to death and undoing of creation occurs. Let me give you an example. So in Numbers, Genesis chapter 1, right? Yahweh creates all his things, and he takes the waters on the third day, right? And he separates them, and what appears? Dry land, which brings forth life, right? So water is used as a life-giving substance in creation. So that thing was actually created because the land had a function. What happens in Numbers chapter 8 and 9, or 6, 8 through 9, with the flood?
Oh,
Or Genesis. Sorry, Genesis with the flood.
Totally wipes it out. Wipes out
With what?
water.
It's an uncreation. He's using as an element of death. So the water is actually used as a threshold substance that takes something from point A to point B. And it's equated to either life or death. Does that make sense? Hopefully it's making sense. Genesis 1 and 6 through 8.
He was using water in the flood as restorative.
Yes, but he had to undo all of the people that were part of his creation originally. So it's actually, yes, it will be, and it's actually in that text, it's being used as both for uncreating and then recreating, restoring. So Genesis 1 and 6 through 8 are central to the metaphor. In Genesis 1, God's creative act brings order out of watery chaos. While Genesis 6 through 8, the flood accounts, describes God's response to a world corrupted with violence. God withdrew restraints placed on the waters at the time of the creation, and they flooded the world once more from the great deep. And the windows of heaven, the primordial waters, are thus symbolic of the absence of order and creation. In the narrative of the flood, they denote the reversal of creation. The fuller understanding of the textual presentation of the red heifer cannot therefore be divorced from the biblical cosmology which undergirds it, the primordial history, Israel's story of origins, which itself is a story of cosmic pollution. We already read this part. But cosmology is thus the ideological framework for ritual action. So you cannot look at this sacrifice and not see the elements pertaining to how the cosmology actually happened with Israel. Seeing how the water was used to bring forth life. This is the same thing that's happening with the mixture of the water and all of the ashes from the heifer to bring forth life. Okay? Cosmological symbolism and allusion to Genesis 1 provide a cogent explanation for an especially puzzling aspect of the red heifer ceremony. Purification is a two-stage process where the waters of cleanliness are to be applied on the third and the seventh day. The symbolism behind the 7-day period as a reference to the 7 days of creation and the use of 7 as a symbol of perfection and completion is self-evident. We understand why it says on 7 days, because it's just like when you are the leper, right? You come back into the camp and you're unclean after 7 days, you're restored back on the 8th day. 7 days is huge. 7 days always points back to the creation week. The rest, the establishment of Yahweh's temple. But why also on the 3rd day? Anybody have an answer? Shout it out.
Resurrection.
That is actually a connection. I posted that on Facebook, right? And I wanted people to see what their answers would be, but I wanted it specifically in context to Israel's cosmology in the beginning of Genesis 1-3. That is a connection. Obviously, that's a connection to Yeshua and the resurrection, that kind of stuff.
Would be the dividing of the waters and the becoming of land.
That's exactly why. Because they're pointing everybody who has come into contact. Remember, death is the most horrific impurity that could happen within the temple sancta. It's the most horrific. It's the worst impurity that can happen.
That's because death is the last enemy.
Death is the last enemy.
The last enemy me?
Who's got chills?
Yes. Yeah, death is not supposed to happen.
It's not.
In Revelation, death is destroyed after Satan is the end.
Right? Because that is when we enter that perfect kingdom on the 8th day, right? It's after the millennial kingdom and death is finally destroyed. So there's got to be a way to deal with this impurity. And he's showing you this in a physical arena in the earthly temple. But everything that happens in the earthly temple is meant to show you something that happens in a larger scale with the heavenly temple and how all creation is restored. And remember, as soon as the fall happened, right? Death, sin, corruption, everything is in every single crevice of creation and has to be dealt with. This is how this all points to Yeshua being the red heifer too. Death has to be dealt with. And you cannot do away with temple service or any sacrifice and think you're going to understand this. We cannot. So the application of the waters on the third day has its analog in the third day of creation, when the separation of the waters brought forth the dry land from out of the primordial abyss. The seventh day represents the fullness and completion of this renewal of creation. So that is one reason why it's done on the third day as well as the seventh day. And obviously, as believers in Yeshua, we understand that it has a connection to you being reinstated back into the kingdom because of death. Hello, that should be number one reason. The recognition that biblical cosmology provides a symbolic framework for several aspects of the ceremony of the red heifer raises the possibility of further parallels to the narratives of Genesis 1-3. One immediate connection is to be found with the nature of the purification itself. The red heifer is a rite which purges ritual impurity, specifically the defilement of death, the human mortal condition. Such ritual impurity is distinct from but nevertheless related to sin. The common denominator of sin and ritual impurity is mortality. The unique characteristic of the red heifer, as it is portrayed in the narrative space in number 19, is it occurs the boundary between life and death, which is implicit in the graded holiness of the tabernacle. In Genesis 3, the interrelationship between sin and mortality is especially forged. For in this grand narrative, the mortal condition of humanity is itself a consequence and transition against the Lord. So, transgression. So you see that all of these graded stages of impurity, this is why we don't understand the true function of being impure and why I take such issue with specific observances. Okay? We know that Yeshua is taking care of this for us, and he's going to be the one that has ultimately cleansed us through his work, right? And that we will eventually enter into his kingdom and enter into his rest. But if we don't understand the functionality of every single sacrifice, how are we going to claim that we know who he is? Well, we got people that just do away with him for whatever reason because they don't investigate every single aspect before they make stupid decisions.
What observances do you take issue with?
The ones I mentioned earlier, where people are imposing that they cannot fellowship with a certain individual, or I can't shake a woman's hand because of them being impure, when the reality is that if we have indeed all come in contact, and by the way, if you've been to a funeral, you've been in contact with someone who's passed. That makes us all unclean. So even if I shake her hand, I'm unclean. That issue is going to be dealt with as soon at some point.
Her, but your own life experience.
Because my own life. So who am I to impose judgment upon somebody else for being impure? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with recognizing that, but don't impose your strict observance of impurity on other people, because the reality is that if you are, you're still unclean too. You're still impure. And I could take that in a whole other direction if I really want to, but I'm not. Hopefully you understand where I'm getting at. That's where I take some certain issues with. The narrative of the creation of man and the Garden of Eden provides the symbolic ground for the rites most peculiar aspect, the red heifer itself. As a conceptual signal, red, unblemished, and unyoked, the victim is analogous of the archetypal man. The heifer's removal from the camp and incineration to the east of it, a return to dust and ashes, along with the destruction of the cedar, the scarlet, the thread, the hyssop, amounts to a repetition in liturgy of the original man's expulsion from the garden. Basically, this is the ultimate enemy, right? That needs to be dealt with, and that's death. And we're relying on our King, we're relying on our Messiah to bring forth life for us, to do away ultimately with the enemy of death. There's many other cosmological things that we could have talked about. I told you that I could not fit, there's no way I could fit everything into this teaching. I only wanted you to see the aspect of wilderness being equated to life, or being equated to death, the land, the promises of Yahweh being equated to death, or to life. See, I'm confused.
You can do it.
I'm trying, bro. But also to see that the water was the threshold substance, because almost all the other sacrifices, we focus on the blood as being that threshold liminal substance that cleanses the altars, right? But we don't ever realize the functionality of this whole mixture of ashes and water from the heifer. She's opened the doors. Now, this is where this points to Yeshua like nowhere else. Now remember that Yeshua was without blemish, the same as the heifer. The location of the altar, right? The location of the altar where they would perform the red heifer sacrifice was where? Mount of Olives, outside the gate, right? From that location where they did the red heifer sacrifice, is you could literally see inside the temple doors. Just like where Yeshua was on the cross. Very, very significant. So John 19:30-35. We've heard these verses before, and I've taught this before, and I owe credit to my beautiful queen that's standing in the threshold door back there, that she actually pointed this out to me when I first started studying Leviticus and temple service. Yeah, come on in here, I'm giving you props. She's like, oh, again? I first started studying Leviticus and this whole ancient Near Eastern stuff like this as I was going through Jacob Milgram's work. If you don't have it, get it, need it, must have it. As I was teaching with Rico at that time, and we were doing the Torah portions every week, and I got to the book of Leviticus, I said, look, I'm not teaching nothing until I get a grasp on this. I'm tired of thinking I knew what the blood was for and all this that kind of stuff. I got through 6 chapters of Milgram's book on just Leviticus 1-5 and completely jacked my world up. Completely jacked it up. Because, obviously, if you guys are part of here, you know why, right? So I started going through all this stuff, and we're reading and studying, and Melanie, I'm explaining this to her, and she goes, what about the stuff that came out of Yeshua's side? And I've been teaching it ever since, and I give her props every time because I didn't see it till she brought up the verse. John 19:30-35. So when Yeshua took the sour wine, he said, it has been accomplished. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. Therefore, since it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the stake on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was the high one, the Jews asked Pilate to have their legs broken and that they be taken away. Therefore the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was impaled with him. But when they came to Yeshua and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and instantly blood and water came out. And he who has seen has witnessed, and his witness is true. And he knows that he is speaking the truth in order that you might believe. That's pretty powerful, right? If we understand the functionality of the water and the blood now, if the blood is the liminal threshold substance that's used to cleanse the altars and elevate a person's status, we know what the purpose of the blood was for. I never knew what the purpose of the water was for until I realized that were cleansed by water all throughout the Torah, all throughout Scripture, that is what cleanses you, just like with the red heifer sacrifice, and elevates you back into a status of being into the kingdom. Where you were once afar off.
And I don't know if you're getting to this, so I'm sorry if I'm jumping, but like the water, the Holy Spirit, are you talking about that or?
Well, I'm going to show you, well, kind of. But if we realize that the blood actually has that function, the water has this function. So Yeshua's blood cleanses the stain of sin in the heavenly realm, right? That's the whole purpose of his blood. Is to cleanse our sin from the heavenly altars, right? And then the water cleanses us. And you are therefore restored back into the kingdom.
And the water coming out is supernatural. When man dies, man does not lose water. If you were stabbed after you died, you do not lose blood and water like that. That they would actually see the difference. You just lose blood.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's supernatural. That was totally
Because it points directly back to the sacrificial system. And we have to understand it. 1 John 5:5-11, and we'll close with this. Who is the one who overcomes the world but he who believes that Yeshua is the Son of Elohim? This is the one that came by water and blood. Yeshua the Messiah, not only by water, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit who bears witness, because the Spirit is the truth. Because there are three who bear witness, the Spirit and the water and the blood. And the three are in agreement. If we receive the witness of men, the witness of Elohim is greater, because this is the witness of Elohim which he has witnessed concerning his Son. The one who believes in the Son of Elohim has the witness in himself. The one who does not believe Elohim has made him a liar, because he has not believed the witness that Elohim has given concerning his Son. And this is the witness that Elohim has given us, everlasting life. And this life is in his Son. The water is used as a life-giving element to restore us back into the kingdom. Have you ever seen the red heifer sacrifice like this before? You can tell me if you guys are way ahead of me. I have never seen it this way before. And everything, the more and more I study this stuff, is it points back to the complete restoration. And just think about it. I mean, just look at the 7 days that the person who is unclean because of death is outside the camp. They're outside the camp for 7 days. We are all outside the camp for 7 days, waiting to be brought back in and declared clean. This is what we've been waiting for. This is the 6,000-year plan that we're going through right now. Waiting to get to that 7th day, and that 7th day is still part of the outside. We're waiting on that millennial kingdom, but that 7th day, it's still there. You don't get inside the camp until after that. You're declared clean on the 7th day. I hope this made sense. I really do. Sometimes I say this stuff, and I'm like, I'm crazy. I should not even be talking about this stuff. Gary, you come up. But I'm very, very thankful for the opportunity to share this. If you want the PowerPoint, if you want the 320-page thesis, Melanie will double-space type it for you. Just kidding. Gary's going to go ahead and bless the bread and the wine, and we'll go downstairs and we'll eat. Amen?
Amen.